Hey folks, you're tuning into Common Groundwater, a Michigan Environmental Council podcast where we connect you to the big, deep, and wide environmental stories across the state. You are tuning in to our first episode of our Project Greenprint miniseries, where we look at the intersection of housing and climate and affordability and discuss how they all work together to create problems, but also to create some solutions. I'm joined today with our scene setter for this mini-series, Nick Manis, the residential real estate reporter for Crain's Detroit business. Thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Bill. I appreciate it.
Not a problem. So we like to start out each episode here on Common Groundwater by asking a question that's a little bit personal, but also one that is really tied into like our topic today. And I thought we'd start out with like one that's nice, big, and grand for us to discuss. And that's, what's kept you here in Michigan? What do you like about Michigan?
Sure.
What's gripped you? Tell me a little bit about your experience here.
Sure. So I'm a lifelong Michigander, and I do use Michigander, despite whatever debate there might be. So yeah, I've lived here my whole life. Grew up in Grand Rapids on the west side of the state. Moved over to Detroit about just over 4 years ago. What's kept me here? I mean, I guess it's kind of interesting. Most of my family has moved on from the state. My dad lives in California. My sister lives in Chicago. I love to visit both those places, but yet, Michigan has just remained home. I kind of like the change of scenery. All things being equal, it's relatively affordable, for sure compared to like California, for instance. Easy to get around, as long as you have a car. I guess that's kind of, what's kept me here is it's, offers a lot. Sure, it's got plenty of problems, but that's true everywhere.
Yeah, that's a great point. I feel like that's a bit similar to what's kept me here. I mean, for me, unlike you, a lot of my family and friends have stayed in Michigan.
Okay.
So that's really is the big kicker. I grew up in the Thumb area and then I've lived around the state since. But I've always been close to at least, one set of friend or one, some family nearby. But I think it's a great state to root for. You're right, there are a lot of problems, I think, that you can get grumpy about or legitimately angry about. But there's also a lot of good, and it's really fun to like be part of that process of trying to make the state better in some small way of our own too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that is great. So as much as we both love the state, people do have some very legitimate gripes. You mentioned it briefly that although compared to the rest of the nation, Michigan is fairly affordable. The reality is that for many folks, things like housing, groceries are really expensive right now, at least in terms of in recent history. And maybe most visible among those kind of cost of living increases is housing. Mm-hmm. Rents have gone up, the cost to buy a home has gone up, the cost to live in a home, making repairs has gone up. Could you maybe set the scene for us a little bit through your real estate reporting experience about like the state of housing in Michigan?
Sure. So yeah, so I cover housing at Crain's Detroit, and yes, absolutely. Cost of housing has gone up. It's gone up in Michigan, and it's gone up everywhere. The simple fact is that Michigan is still just about the most affordable place you can live in the United States. There are probably some pockets in other places, but all things being equal, I think our median cost of a house in Michigan is about $250,000 thereabouts, and in the rest of the United States, throughout the United States, the median cost is like $376,000 is the number I saw yesterday. So, that still makes for a pretty affordable place to live, compared to so many other places. And I recognize that is not felt across the board by a lot of people. There are plenty of people who are paying far too much of their income towards rent or mortgage payment. And, right now in the United States, we've, just kind of been so structurally underbuilt in housing, and that's, definitely true in Michigan. I don't want to say it's particularly true, but it's not, I don't know how it necessarily compares to Albany, New York, for instance, but, we are very structurally underbuilt in housing in Michigan, and that's why we continue to see the costs go up.
Mm-hmm. Could you explain a little bit more about what you mean by structurally underbuilt?
Sure. So if the numbers that I hear from like the Michigan State Housing Development Authority, which is the state's housing arm, basically, they'll tell you we're about 190,000 housing units short in terms of newer, updated housing. That would be rental housing, for sale housing. That's a lot to do, and the simple fact is that housing is kind of uneconomical. There's not, it's hard to build or renovate housing in a way that is affordable for everybody, that doesn't result in them spending, say, more than 30% of their income on housing, which is the general number that is used for determining what's affordable or not.
Yeah. And is that the sort of feeling that you're also hearing from business owners, business leaders, in terms of actually building out or renovating these sorts of homes as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's it's definitely true in people in the housing business, developers, architects, contractors, and it's true, for people not in that business where they're having trouble getting people to fill jobs in Michigan because there's not adequate supply of what would be considered updated and affordable housing.
Gotcha. And so in this case, these 190,000 sorts of units or houses, homes, whatever you may call them, it goes beyond just there's not necessarily 190,000 people looking for those homes themselves.
Yeah.
It's really creating that stock to give some people some maneuverability between.
Yeah, I think that's about right.
Okay.
Yes, I mean, I do get this question a lot, and it's a hard question to answer. Is when we, and I think we're going to get into this a little bit more, but we talk about growing the state's population, and if we're stagnant, only slightly growing as we have been, I get this question a lot of, well, why do we need so much housing? And I mean, it's a difficult question to answer, but I think it really boils down to we have an outdated housing stock in so many cases where the housing that is there is just not up to what people would consider to be modern, amenable living.
Yeah. As much as we might love the retro look,
oh yeah,
it's going to be can sometimes be an issue if it hasn't been the homes haven't been loved too much. Yeah. And maybe that's a good pivot maybe into another sort of issue that Michigan is facing, at least something that elected leaders have kind of pointed out to be an issue, which is, as you mentioned, our population. Michigan has kind of stagnated in terms of relative to the rest of the nation since the 1980s in terms of its population, which I think leaders, correct me if I'm wrong, have cited can lead to issues like an aging population that we need to take care of, like a smaller workforce, and also less representation in our federal government.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've partially answered this question already, but it seems to me that there's a correlation between a need for more housing as we work to hopefully grow our population or at least stabilize it as well.
I think that's definitely true. I mean, if you listen to, for instance, Governor Gretchen Whitmer, she's talked a lot about need for housing as a mechanism to grow a population. As I alluded to earlier, if you hear from if I talk to a lot of business leaders in Southeast Michigan, they'll say, I'm having trouble filling these open jobs that I have because, attracting people to Michigan. And, I don't think it's strictly related to housing, but, housing is going to be your biggest payment of anything you make every month for the vast majority of people. And so, having that as an amenity is pretty critical to our economic and overall, success as a state, I think.
Yeah. One way I've heard of it too, from the Growing Michigan Together Council, the population sort of advisory group for elected leaders, is that it goes beyond just the home in terms of trying to bring in people to Michigan or keep people in Michigan. It's where that home is located, right? Mm-hmm. It's about the school district that you're in. It's about how easy it is to get to amenities, things like that. It's very much the community as well as the home,
right?
Physically.
Right.
Yeah. So we've talked about the cost of living, housing. We talked about how housing relates to our population, but as an employee of the Michigan Environmental Council, I'd be remiss not to mention climate.
Of course.
And I think this adds in an interesting dynamic to the whole sort of affordability population debate. As you've reported on, like Michigan is increasingly being considered a climate haven, or at least a climate haven for the future.
Yep.
A place where people can go to avoid the worst effects of climate change.
Yep.
We have a lot of water, we have good crop diversity, not too many sorts of natural disasters like hurricanes and the like.
We saw in New York City this morning, weirdly enough.
Yeah, well, like a multi-magnitude level earthquake.
Yeah.
We don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Although who knows after that news broke. But it's an interesting point because, as you had mentioned, nationally, Michigan is fairly affordable, even though we might feel the pinch right now as Michiganders. But Michigan is also losing population, but Michigan can also attract new people because it's a climate haven. It's a very strange sort of situation.
There's a lot going on there, that's for sure.
Yes, yeah. And maybe before we try to bring it all together, like, are they motivated at all to stay in Michigan or for folks outside to come to Michigan because of this idea of climate change?
I think what keeps people in Michigan is, a hard question to answer. There are so many reasons why, a person might choose to stay or leave. But yeah, I mean, to your point, as far as some of those worst effects of climate change, we don't have to worry about them in nearly the same amount. It's going to be hot in the summer. Unfortunately, we're not seeing as much snow as we used to get. As a former side of the west side of the state, in the middle of the snow belt, I do sometimes miss the snow that doesn't hit the Detroit area. But yeah, we do have some things to offer there. Should some of those worst possible outcomes that we all kind of see and hear about, should they hit places like Florida, Texas. What I think is so ironic, and I've reported on this a little bit, is, I did a story a little bit ago, 6 months ago or so, looking at specifically the Jefferson Chalmers neighborhood of Detroit. For those who aren't familiar, it's on the far east side of Detroit, right on the border with Grosse Pointe, and it's on the lower east side of Detroit, meaning it's right near the Detroit River, and it's on these very cool canals that a lot of people don't even know about in Detroit. It's a really cool feature, a really cool neighborhood, but it is prone to flooding because of its proximity to the river and these canals that people live on, where they literally have boats that they have a boathouse and they in their backyard and you can go out in these canals. But so I did this story kind of looking at it, and whether we're talking about the Jefferson Chalmers neighborhood of Detroit or other places, those threats of climate change definitely do register with people, I think, when it comes to their housing choices and where they choose to live. But it's not really moving the needle that much. I think one needs to look no further than the population gains that places like Florida and Texas have seen, which are, prone to hurricanes, severe heat, all these, other issues that are likely to be kind of compounded by climate change, and yet those are the places that are still gaining the most population.
Yeah. The Jefferson Chalmers neighborhood also reminds me of a place I grew up near, which is Algonac.
Oh, okay.
Way far south in the thumb of Michigan, and you would go into Algonac along this main road, and water was on both sides. Like it felt almost like at road level, and I just knew anytime you had a heavy rain, you could expect major issues in transportation and home flooding. It was really eerie to see, I think, even in the drier part of the season. So
sure, but I mean, how cool is it to be able to live on a canal?
Right. Yeah.
That's kind of a pretty unique feature that not a lot of places have. So
yeah, to own a car and a boat.
Yeah, exactly.
Take it out to overdrive. Yeah, you do make a good point though, in that looking at the larger picture of the U.S. As much as Michigan is a climate haven, that is something that the trouble with climate change, it feels, is that it can still feel very abstract, and so or like a more distant threat. And even if it is a real threat here and now, it can sometimes be tough to see those connections.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing is we have seen all these events that seem likely driven by climate change, but yet they just kind of feel like, a thing that happens and a thing that is happening, as opposed to part of this much broader kind of scarier future that could very much arise.
Yeah, definitely so. A sort of mundane sort of
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
flooding, things of that
Yeah.
nature. That's great. Well, before we try to bring everything together a bit more and talk about housing as like the intersection of like solutions for climate or for affordability, what have you. I'd first like to give us a little break to reassess and to give a little shout out to our sponsor, which is CalSec. So stay tuned. The Common Groundwater podcast is brought to you by CalSec, an international company headquartered in Kalamazoo that provides expertly crafted ingredients that help food and beverages look better, taste better, and last longer, all naturally. CalSec has set aggressive goals to send zero waste to landfills by 2030 and to create net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. You can learn more at calsec.com. When we left off at the sponsor break, we kind of set out a few different scenarios, really, talking about how housing kind of fits into some of these greater problems that Michigan faces. Its cost of living, its population stagnation, its work to fight back or help prepare us for climate change. Ultimately, housing is one slice of the larger pie of those solutions, right? Housing can be a way that we can make living easier. It can be a way that we can fight climate change, but it's a pretty existential task to think about. There's 4.5 million homes in Michigan.
Yep.
I'm curious, like, what are you hearing from folks in your reporting? Can we take on a task like this to make our housing better?
Sure. I mean, so as I kind of mentioned at the start, I usually use these MISHDA figures at a Michigan State Housing Development Authority that says, we're about 190,000 units short of kind of what we would need for modern, amenable housing. That is a very tough task, because building that in a way that is affordable to people is really difficult. The thing that I hear over and over, when I talk to people building houses, renovating houses, it's cost. Cost of land is up, cost of materials is up, cost of contractors, it's all up. So, that house that maybe you were able to build for, a few $100,000 in 2017, 2018, whatever it is probably double that now. So, we have this big economic challenge. One thing that I like to think about is, I've done some reporting on this, sometimes very deservedly so, but, investors or flippers, as they're often called, people go in and, buy an old house, renovate it, then immediately sell it at a profit, Yeah, they do sometimes get a bad rap, and sometimes deservedly so, but they also have a really important role to play in this. There are people who do go in and actually do the work, in many cases, to renovate old homes and make them into something that is livable. And some of them sometimes do shoddy work, but many of them don't. And that's some of them are just small one-off projects, and maybe they'll make a little bit of money on it, but that's all of that plays a role in addressing this much larger issue. So I think that's kind of an important thing. I like to focus on some of those smaller topics. I live not far from here where we're recording in Detroit. I live in the New Center neighborhood, and I live in a pre-World War II era, multifamily building that was recently renovated, and a pretty nice apartment building, and we're seeing a lot of those. So it's I think it's important to remember that it's not all gleaming glass and steel skyscrapers downtown or something like that. It is kind of a lot of smaller projects that all do have an impact at the margins, even if they're not going to be these big high profile projects. That all of this plays a role in it, I think.
Yeah, and that actually brings up another question that I kind of came into our talk today with. Like, I grew up like right on the fringe between like the thick of the thumb of Michigan and Metro Detroit.
Sure.
And so my family would go into Macomb,
Mhm.
like Macomb Township, Clinton Township, to do our shopping.
Sure.
And like over the years, every time I come back home, I see that we have more and more subdivisions. It's like a slow creep toward my hometown.
Oh.
But it makes me think that I've always assumed that like building a home has to be a lot better or a lot cheaper than renovating. But it seems like at least on a small scale, that there is some validity then in like looking at all of our old housing stock and making some renovations.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's the point. Is we need housing of all types.
Mhm.
I did a story a couple weeks ago that got some pushback from people. I think it's an important point to make, and it was based on this report from the Minneapolis Federal Reserve that showed that building these high-end luxury apartment buildings, as they're doing in some places, like downtown Detroit, for instance, that actually has a really important role to play for affordable housing. In that I think the study that they came up with, the numbers showed that for every 100 units, let me look it up. I have it in my notes here. I think it was that for every 100 new market rate units that open, the development of those units leads to 70 new vacancies in lower income areas. So, basically, if you're somebody who can afford a $3,000 or $4,000 a month apartment, having that available means that there's more units available for people who don't make nearly that much money, which is obviously the vast majority of the population. So, basically, I think the point is we need housing of all types at all price points, and that's how we're going to solve it. It's not, all apartments for people who don't make much money. It's not all subdivisions out in the far reaches of Macomb County. It's all of the above.
Yeah, much like how housing is just one piece of the larger puzzle for solving these things that we've talked about today.
Yeah.
The actual work within the housing space has to be varied.
Yeah.
So naturally, working for an advocacy nonprofit like the Environmental Council, my coworkers are going out, into the Capitol to our state departments to advocate for different things. And one of the things that we're advocating for is a heavier emphasis on energy efficiency upgrades in homes, electrifying certain appliances. The reason being, it really seems that our elected leaders are really placing a focus on housing, and what better way than to make housing not only more affordable for folks once they move into a space by having more efficient appliances and but also help us fight climate change a bit better too. I'm curious from your end, is energy efficiency, electrification, things of that nature, things sustainability oriented, are they being considered more and more in sorts of in development patterns and renovations?
I definitely think they are. I do quite a bit on of coverage on the home building side, and I think there's definitely a push. I don't think it's particularly new. I think the understanding among the home building community is that green building, sustainability, whatever you might call it, is good for business. It's can save them money on the front end, and it can save the end user, the person who ultimately occupies that home, money on the back end. So I think that's definitely a push. Right now I've kind of been covering. I've done a few stories lately on there's kind of a fight brewing between the home building community in the state and the state government. The state's Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs is going through a process to update our codes, the standard for what building codes are used, and they're considering this. I believe it's a code that is used in many other places in the world that would mandate certain efficient insulation, all these types of things that go into the building of a home, and the home builders that many of the home builders I've spoken with are are opposed to this, not because they're opposed to the idea of sustainable materials in their homes, but they claim they can meet those same standards or better without these mandates from the state government that they say are really just to add cost but don't actually address the same issues. So that is something that I've been following. That it's not yet clear which way it's going to go. But yeah, I think that's definitely front and center. I think another way that we're seeing it is, for instance, more a push towards like modular housing, which has long been kind of had a little bit of a stigma attached to it. People kind of think of double wides and things like that, but there's a lot of people doing more modular type building. I think that's something that's also a way to meet our broader housing goals in the state, and also offer some sustainable benefits. These are things that can literally be manufactured and assembled somewhere else, and then just taken to the site and dropped, and basically you have a home.
That's great, and I should note to our viewers as well that in our next episode we'll be kind of really honing in on some of these specific solutions to housing. So we'll be really diving deep on, for example, building codes, renovations, things like that too. In the meantime, though, it's always great to talk about issues at large, but it can kind of be hard to actually visualize them. And even though homes are very visual for a lot of us, we live in them after all. Like, I'm curious, are there any sorts of like projects or trends that you're following that you're particularly interested in when it comes to this space of like housing in the future, so to speak?
Sure. I think one thing that everyone's kind of looking to see is, kind of as we talked about, where you lived out in, just on the periphery of Metro Detroit, and now you're seeing, these, new subdivisions being built. There's a very simple reason why that's happening, and that's, builders are, that's where the home builders can make the most money in terms of building these kinds of big, 3, 4, 5,000 square foot homes, some call them McMansions. That's where the home builders can make the most money, but there's definitely a want and a desire and a need for, home building on a, much smaller type homes. People think of as, the starter home. If you look around any suburb of Metro Detroit, Oak Park, St. Clair Shores, you see all these, 1950s built ranch houses. Mm-hmm. We don't really build those much anymore because, as we kind of talked about, it's kind of an uneconomical thing to do. But there's definitely some push to do that. I don't think it's happening in any massive scale right now, but I'll be kind of following to see if that happens more. If there's more, just kind of everyday, homes, 2,000 square feet or something like that, or even smaller. I'm also kind of following, as I said, these, smaller renovations of apartment buildings in my neighborhood. These buildings that were built in the 1920s and stuff like that are now being, rehabbed and made into housing. In many cases, relatively affordable housing, and a lot of times they have, various, subsidies attached to them that allow for them to, the rents to be well below market rate for those who can't afford those market rate rents that we see. And then, kind of just the real estate nerd in me is very interested in what the condos at the Hudson site downtown are going to look like. That's supposed to be, it's supposed to be the highest end, condos that we've ever seen here in Detroit from what little information is out there. So I'll be very curious to see what those wind up looking like.
Yeah.
The nerd perspective in me.
Yeah. Well, and hearing just those various things that you're looking into, it reminds me that you get like a great glance into everything. You get to I'm sure tour some of these buildings.
Oh, I do. Yeah, it's pretty fun. I like a good hard hat tour for sure.
Yeah, that's great. And maybe to close us out, if you're comfortable, where do you think, where do you hope, or where do you think housing in Michigan might be, say, 20, 30 years down the line? Maybe a tough question because so much of housing is piecemeal. It's a bit by bit sort of process.
It is. I think, one thing to always think about is, the kind of as I mentioned about the idea of building more luxury units. The high end luxury units of today are the much more affordable apartments of tomorrow. Down the road. So if we build enough now, maybe we have the housing to meet the needs down the road. What does it look like? I mean, home building has always been kind of a traditional, industry, that's slow to adapt to new technology and things like that. I think they are doing that in some regards. I wrote a story a few months ago about a 3D printed house that went on the market here in Detroit. I believe it was the first 3D printed house in Michigan. Will we see more of that? I suspect we will. Again, is that going to, save us? I don't think so. But it's yet again just one more piece of the puzzle that can be, could potentially be put into to adoption to help meet some of those challenges.
That's awesome. Thank you. And perhaps this is a great plug too to say that if you check our description link, you'll find a link to Crain's Detroit business, so you can stay on top of these sorts of projects and storylines here.
Definitely give us a read.
Great. All right. Well, in that case, then, Nick, thanks so much for taking the time of your day to join us. Really do appreciate it.
Thank you, Mo. I really appreciate the time as well.
Great. And to those listening too, thank you first for listening, and then second, keep a lookout for our second episode where we get more into some of the solutions of housing that are being proposed. And we'll also release episodes in the coming weeks ahead that will give some very specific examples as to what a house of the future might look like. We'll be talking to some folks who are on the ground, so to speak, in the development space and the renovation space to do that. With that then, Nick, thanks again. Thanks to our sponsor, CalSec, and to those listening, we will see you soon.